Grandma Oakley, also known as Betty Oakley, Betty Brown Oakley, Great Nana Oak, or Great Great Grandma O, is likely the most interesting person many of us know.
Oh, yeah.
She has many qualities that make her wonderful and has a magnetic personality that draws people to her in a
Oh,
special way. She is the matriarch of the Oakley family with over 30 great grandchildren and even a great great grandchild. She has had innumerable friendships over her lifetime and has lived during a time of tremendous change in the world and in our country. We thought it would be a great treasure to record an interview with her so that future generations can learn from her
oh
vast
my.
and valuable experience from her directly.
Well, that all sounds very lovely, and I wonder who you're talking about. But I'll fill in for now anyway. And you did ask me about my parents.
Well, I'd like to start before that.
Oh, okay.
Where were you, or what year were you born, Grandma?
1922,
Okay, and where?
La Crosse, Wisconsin,
And your maiden name?
Brown.
Okay, and how about your first and middle name?
Betty Marjorie.
Okay. Tell us about your family.
Well, I was born to David and Cora Brown, their second child. My older brother, 3 years older, his name was Ed. And then followed by three younger sisters. And my brother wanted a brother so badly that he called my youngest sister Pete. And he did that all his life. That was her name as far as he was concerned. We lived in a modest, very small home where my mother and dad had lived. When they were married, they moved in with my grandmother, my dad's mother, who was not real happy with that situation. But they managed and got along just fine until she had a stroke and was bedridden. And my mother, besides taking care of three young children, was also taking care of her mother-in-law. And I remember that it was my birthday. I was going to be 7 years old, and so we walked down to the corner store and got a quart of ice cream. You didn't keep it in the house back then, you know. And by the time we got back home with it, my grandmother had died.
Oh.
And that was the end of my birthday party, and I was most concerned, of course, about that. We lived in that same house for another 5 or 6 years, and then bought the house next door to us, and we thought it was a palace. Well, it was far from that, but it was a big step up.
Okay.
Should we go into my childhood school?
Yeah, whatever you'd like to talk about your childhood would be great. What do you? Can you tell us what your very first memory is? Do you have?
Well, one of my very first memories, and this is kind of ridiculous and might say more about my mother than it does about me, but we had eggs for dinner, and I liked them, and everybody was finished, and I wanted another egg. And she said, well, okay, I'll make another egg for you, but you have to be sure and eat it. And I said, yes, I would. Well, it took her a while, of course, to get it ready. And when she brought it, I had lost my appetite and didn't want to eat it. And she said, you're going to sit there until you eat that egg, which I did. I finally got up, ran into the bathroom, and lost the egg. She came running in to see what was going on, and I pointed and said, there's your darn egg. So
Very good.
that's one of my early memories anyhow. I was probably 3 or 4.
Wow. And what did your parents do for a living?
Both of my parents' fathers died when they were children. My mother was only 2 when her father died, and my dad's dad had died when Dad was 13. he had to quit school and get a job to take care of the family. He had a much older sister who was already married and was a half-sister and gone, but he had a two-year younger brother. So he had to quit school at 13 and get a job to support them. And he did so many different menial jobs, like working in a bottling works where all you did was to put caps on the bottles. Mm-hmm. And from there, he let's see what else he did after. Well, I think we learned to be a barber somewhere along the line. He took correspondence school classes so that he could get a better education, and ended up working in a post office as a clerk. And I remember his hours were always from 2 until 10:30, and that just seemed routine to me. We always had dinner at noon and supper in the evening. And most of the activities that we did together had to be in the morning, and I remember often going on picnics where we would bring along this big frying pan, and he would fry bacon and eggs and potatoes and whatever else he could think of to put into it. Then every summer we would drive up to visit his half-sister who lived in Merrill, Wisconsin, and that was a big journey for us then. Mm-hmm. It was, probably 175 miles.
And that's in central Wisconsin, right?
And our cars were, we had a Chevrolet that was just very old and kind of decrepit, and we always carried another axle along in case we broke one along the way, and we often did. And tires, when a tire blew out, you brought out your patching kit, took it off and patched it so that you could go the rest of the way. We'd eat breakfast at home in the morning and get to Aunt Ed and Uncle Lon's house by dinner time that night. Brought along a picnic lunch to eat on the way. Didn't have fast food places then.
Wow. What would you say is the most exciting memory or moment of your childhood?
Well, one that I remember, and I'm sure my brother and sisters never forgot, was on 4th of July when we had a big box of fireworks, and that was our fireworks for all day and for the evening works. Well, I took the whole box next door. They had an outdoor swing, and I sat there and lit these little penny firecrackers and threw them. Well, one of them I didn't throw far enough. It fell into the box, and the whole thing went off. We had neighbors coming out looking to see what in the world was happening. And obviously it was not very popular with my family because that was the end of the fireworks.
What about your childhood school? What do you remember from that?
Well, I remember going to kindergarten. It was only about a block and a half from where we lived. And I remember this boy whose name was Donald Brinkman, and he liked me, and the thing that we did mostly was to play games. And he would always make sure that there was another girl on one side of me and he was on the other side of me. And every day after school, he brought me home. And now I wonder what his mother thought when, a half hour later he's getting home from school. And he turned out to be a very good friend. And a few years ago, I happened to find his address, and I wrote to him and just told him how much I had enjoyed him through the years. Said, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, and he didn't. So that's the end of that story.
Tell us a little bit about, growing up in that era, electricity, amenities.
Okay. All right. Yes, we did have. We had indoor plumbing, which a lot of people didn't have then, and we did have electricity. The first radio that I ever heard, my cousin built. It was one of these crystal sets, and we just had the earphones. We figured out how to take those apart so two people could listen at the same time. Of course, there wasn't much to listen to back then either. I think we had one radio station in La Crosse. Of course, TV, that was much, much later. But I also remember it being so hot in the summertime and no air conditioning. But my mother had a small fan that she would carry around with her and plug it in wherever she would be working, because the only way she got any relief from it.
Can you give us some examples of different chores that you did at that time?
Well, I remember every Saturday morning we were supposed to get up and help clean the house. And we would stay in bed until we'd hear my mother start the vacuum cleaner. And then we would be up, and that was mostly our job, was cleaning the house. Just dusting and vacuuming and that sort of thing. Remember my mother washing windows with kerosene and newspaper. Something about that combination got our windows really sparkling clean.
And then can you tell us a little bit more about grade school and then high school?
Okay. Then when grade school, we lived about 5 or 6 blocks from that school, and we walked, of course, and always came home for lunch too, so we got a lot of exercise in. Each class had their own teacher, and they all had different ways of teaching and different personalities, and I can remember some of them very well, and some of them I would rather forget, I think. And I was a pretty good student except for math. And I remember bringing home my report card one time, and we got graded in numbers back then, and I got a 69 written in red on my math test, my math score. I remember my dad saying, I'm going to have to sit down with you and we're going to have to work this out together. And he did help me too. Then after we finished 6th grade, we went into junior high, which was in the high school building. And that, again, was only a block and a half from home. It was interesting. We had some teachers who were really very good. And I had a Latin teacher, and the rest of my friends couldn't understand why I liked Latin, but that was my favorite subject back then.
How many kids were in your class?
Well, the classes were all probably 35 or 40. They were good-sized classes. And I sang in the a cappella choir, and I played the clarinet in the marching band, and I think some of the question there was about women's sporting activities. There weren't any.
Okay, and
okay, let's stop right there.
Yeah.
All right. So roll.
so Grandma, tell us about high school, and did you have school dances or prom, homecoming?
Oh, our high school, we did a lot of different things there, and we did a lot with our a cappella choir, performed in many different places in La Crosse. And the marching band, I remember when they built the new bridge across the Mississippi River, and we marched in that parade, and it poured down rain. But we kept right on going and kept playing, and everybody was dripping wet, but it was fun. We enjoyed it. And see, I remember it. If it hadn't rained, I probably would have forgotten all about it.
Were your classes co-ed, or was this...
Oh, yes, it was all co-ed, yeah.
Did you have a boyfriend?
No, I really didn't, and had a lot of friends, boys and girls, and we kind of had a clique where we would go to each other's houses and have parties, but we didn't pair off, you know, like now kids do in middle school.
Can you touch a little bit on that time? At what point in school were you when the Great Depression era was?
I was pretty young. I was maybe 9 or 10, and I don't remember much about it. I do remember hearing about this Wall Street, but I thought that was a wall, and they said that that people were jumping off high buildings, and then Wall Street, I thought it fell. I really had no idea what was going on.
Tell us a little bit about your decision to go to nursing school and that time.
Okay. When I from early on, I wanted to be a nurse. I don't know why I got that idea, but I did. And when I finished high school, I finished in January, graduated in January, and so got a job in a hospital as a nurse's aide, and worked there for the rest of that summer, and then went to college in La Crosse for a year. And that was a lot of fun. We had a lot of activities that we did in college. Met a lot of new people. It was just like a whole new world to me. And I had been accepted in nurses training, but you couldn't go until you were 19. So I had to wait and work. I worked another summer then at the hospital before I went in. We entered in September of 1941, and I did have a boyfriend at that time who was in the National Guard and was supposed to be released be finished with his time there the end of November that year. No, I'm wrong. The end of December. And it was December 11th, then Pearl Harbor. And I remember working at the hospital and coming home, and all of the girls in my dorm were sitting around. All we had was a little radio, and it was down in the lobby, and everybody was sitting around listening to it. And I said, well, what in the world's going on? And they said, well, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I said, where's Pearl Harbor? Nobody ever had heard of Pearl Harbor until that happened. And things changed in the school then because so many of the RNs left to go in the Army. So we were given a lot more responsibility at a very young age without a lot of training. But people lived, so I guess we did our job.
Okay, so we were talking about when you were in nursing school and in Pearl Harbor. So can you tell us a little bit about your training? And
Sure. I remember things were very, very different in hospitals back then than they are now. When people had surgery, there was no recovery room. They went right back to their bed. And my first assignment was to stay with this woman who had just come out of surgery, and the only instruction I had was, don't let her swallow her tongue. I had no idea what in the world that meant. And then they also said, if you have any problems, just call the anesthesia department. Well, I tried to call there and nobody answered, so. And this woman did not swallow her tongue, no thanks to me, but it was very frightening. And there were a lot of things that we did that were very, very frightening. But we worked many hours. We did a lot of work. We did a lot of, we had older nurses who would tell us, well, when we were in training, we had to clean the rooms too, because they thought we had it pretty easy. Let's see what we did that. Oh, I'm goofing up.
So was this in La Crosse?
We changed every 3 months. We would go to a different service, and so it was all new. And the hospitals then, you were very divided in that you would have your orthopedics on one floor, your heart, all your different diseases were handled in their own specific areas, which was really a good way for us to learn because you concentrated on that one thing during that time. We worked in 3 different hospitals. It was the Worrell Hospital, and the Kaler Hotel had a hospital on 3 floors, which was kind of different too, but it was a good place to work. And the Colonial Hospital, which was more like a local hospital for the local residents. The rest of our patients were almost from someplace else. And when we would walk down the streets, you'd look at the cars and it'd be license plates from all over. And we had a lot of foreign people that came in too. I took care of one man who was some royalty in Egypt, and I was working nights, and we'd come on at 10:30 at night, and he had during the day he had special nurses, but his light would come on as soon as I'd get on duty, and I'd go in and he'd make up something that he needed, he wanted me to come in and talk to him, visit with him, and got to know him pretty well. And when he was able to be up and about, he took me to a movie, which was, it was fun. We enjoyed it, and he enjoyed it. His English was not great, but he understood it very well. Then I found out the next day from one of the head nurses, you really shouldn't be going out with him. That nurse that he has during the day is his wife. Well, I didn't know that, so you could get into a lot of trouble one way or another too. Another thing I remember about training is that my mom and dad would come up and visit, and they would let me know when they were coming, and they'd always bring all this food with them, and they'd say, just have some of your friends, and we went down to Silver Lake at a picnic grounds, and sometimes there'd be 15, 20 of the kids that weren't on duty that would come, and we'd have a big picnic. They all liked that a lot. The food there was not great, and we used to have a lot of beets, and nobody was particularly fond of them, and we'd always say, well, somebody must have paid their bill in beets. And they tasted like it. Was
there rationing going on at that time?
Oh yes, during the war, then there was rationing. Yeah, of course, none of us had cars. Nobody had cars, but there was gas rationing, and there was meat rationing and butter. I remember, and rubber goods was all ration too. It was anything that they needed for the war effort, of course, we couldn't get. But it was no great problem for us because we were fed and housed, and Then our last 6 months of training, we were assigned or were asked by someone to come and be their assistant. And I got asked to go to surgery, which I hated, and to dermatology, which I knew nothing about. So that's where I went and worked there for my 6 months, and then I was finished with training. I had a 2 weeks vacation, and when I came back, I was supposed to still be the assistant to this woman in dermatology. Well, during the 2 weeks I was gone, she had decided she had done that long enough and she wanted to do something a little simpler, and I don't know what department she went to, but here a fresh grad came in and I was the head nurse in dermatology. And of course that's where I met my husband. So it wasn't a complete waste. Yeah, it was an interesting time. There was so much going on in the world that we didn't know about, and we hear about it now. You know, the concentration camps, we never knew anything about that. And there's one thing that, well, John asked me to put this in. This was after I'd been dating your dad, but I wasn't, we weren't engaged. And I kept hearing from my friends who had gone into the service, and they said it was great because they sat at the desk and they had corpsmen that did all the work. It sounded pretty good because I'd been running this floor all by I had a student nurse who was my assistant, and all of the rest were students. So it was hard work. I decided maybe I'd join the service. So I was going to go down after work that day, and just before I was ready to leave, we got a new patient in, very ill patient who had to be put in an oxygen tent. None of the nurses, the student nurses had ever done that. Nobody knew how to do it. So I stayed and got it all set up and got her all taken care of. By then it was 5 o'clock and the what do you call it, the place where you go to register was closed. And that weekend, Roosevelt froze nurses to their jobs. They didn't need any more. And so that's how close I came to none of you being here today.
So how did you end up meeting Grandpa Oak?
Well, he was a dermatologist, and he came and he worked with me on that floor. And for 6 months of that time, he had to live in the hospital because he was on call all the time. And we just got to know each other through that and dated some. And one time, I'd been dating another doctor there too, and this Christmas they both asked me if I would come home and meet their families. And, well, the way it turned out that time, I didn't have to make the decision. I couldn't get the time off from work, so I didn't have to decide right then. But anyway, it worked out that I fell in love with your grandpa, and we decided we would get married. And about 2 months before we were getting married that June, it was in April, I got scarlet fever. And they don't know why. There was not another case in Rochester at that time. But they put me in isolation and at St. Mary's Hospital, where they had converted the doctor's, Mayo's first operating room was the room where they put their people who had to be in isolation. So there was this big two scrub sinks, and a bed and a bedside stand and a lamp, and that was my room. And I had a lot of time to think. I couldn't have company. No one could come and visit me except Oak, because he could gown up and come in and talk to me. So, but I had a lot of time to think, and I thought, are you sure you want to get married? You know, what are you thinking? You know, by then I had met his family, and you know, and his a whole different level of than I was used to.
How do you mean?
Well, they're a very wealthy family. His dad, you know, was a doctor. All of his other three brothers were all doctors, and they were more of the elite. We were the working class, you know. So it was pretty frightening, really. But I think when he comes in next time, I'm going to tell him I don't want to get married. Well, then when he'd come, I was glad to see him. I never said anything. So there again, near miss of you being here.
So did he ask you to marry him? And
I guess he must have, because I don't remember asking him. So I'm pretty sure he must have. But I don't remember any specific. He didn't get down on one knee or anything like the guys do these days.
But was there a period when you were considering accepting his proposal? And at that point?
Just at that time when I was in isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there were a few things that might make somebody think that. He was 14 years older than I was. He was Catholic. I was Lutheran. He was used to a whole different style of life than I was, but it worked.
How would you describe his personality at that time?
Quite serious, very serious about his work, but we had a lot of fun too, and had a lot of friends there that were in the same predicament as we were, you know. And there they did, every month they had what was called a fellows dance. See, the men there were all on fellowships. They were called the fellows. And they would have a dance at the country club, a formal affair. And I had gone there several times with different doctors, but I went with Oak then too, and we got serious. So that was one of the fun things that we always did. He was not a great dancer, and he didn't really like to dance, and I loved to dance, so that wasn't a problem. There was all these other people you could dance with.
Can you tell us about your wedding and what you remember from that?
Oh, okay. I have to have a drink. Well, since my parents were not too crazy about my getting married, and we decided we would just have a very simple wedding. We were married at Notre Dame. He had graduated from Notre Dame, and were married at Notre Dame in the little log chapel there. And his brother Ed and his wife Sue were our attendants. That was it, other than the priest. But we had planned, he had planned that we would have this brunch at this nice restaurant there. And we, well, back in those days when in the meantime, I had joined the Catholic Church, and my first communion was on my wedding day. And then you didn't eat or drink anything after midnight. And of course, I was still recuperating from my so I was not in the best of health. but we didn't eat anything, and then we didn't have our brunch until 1 o'clock that afternoon, hadn't had anything, and Oak's brother, Uncle Gene, had sent a couple bottles of champagne, which I'd never had before. So we drank champagne and toasted everybody, and I remember Ed, his brother, who was his best man, drinking his champagne and then throwing his glass into the fireplace. We get a lot of little ruckus, I guess, but I don't even remember what we had to eat. But then we drove from when we left there, and this got kind of late in the afternoon, we drove to Delphus and surprised his mother and dad. They didn't know we were coming there. And we just visited with them for a while, and then we drove on to Toledo and stayed with Jean and Marie that night, and then left the next morning. We had a month vacation, honeymoon, out west in Yellowstone and Glacier and up into Canada, and came back and right into St. Paul, where Oak was going into practice with this other dermatologist. We rented a house from someone. It was whose aunt, I think, had died and left it to them, and they didn't quite know what they were going to do with it yet, but they let us rent it. And it was really old and ramshackled, and I said I didn't dare vacuum for fear I'd pick the rugs up in the vacuum cleaner. And but we were there for. Oh, and then I knew no one. I didn't know a soul, and I wasn't used to just sitting at home doing nothing. So I decided I'd get a job. So I did. I got a job as an office nurse with an obstetrician. Now said I worked for him for 3 months, and he worked for me for 15 years. So, but anyway, then we bought our house here in St. Paul, and I was pregnant. So, pregnant women didn't work back in those days, you know. So, but I had a house to get settled and make livable. So, so that's that story.
Did you plan ahead of time to have a big family?
No.
7 kids?
No. Just happened.
So can you tell us some of your favorite memories of Grandpa Oak and raising the kids in St. Paul?
Oh boy. Oh, there are lots and lots of memories. But raising a family is really interesting when you're living in a community where you have no relatives to help you with anything. That was a little bit of a challenge. And of course, back then I didn't have a car, so that was a challenge, although we did learn to use the bus system. Remember when John was born, that wasn't so bad because nobody had to be at home taking care of somebody else. But when Tom was born, we had a woman come in. Then John was 3 and Tom was a year, and then I was pregnant with twins. And we decided maybe I needed some more help. And so I looked in the paper, and there was this woman saying that she was looking for this sort of a job. And I called her and talked to her, and she was really interested in coming, especially when I told her I was having twins, because she had twins herself. And she had been working as the cook at the cathedral in St. Paul. Now, well, that's a pretty good thing, you know, that makes it sound like she should be all right. So I hired her. Well, she came out to the house, and I met her and hired her. And I remember your grandpa saying, "You hired her without even getting any references?" And then when I told him where she'd been working and everything, he said, "Well," and then after he met her too, she was just this typical little older woman who was interested in children, especially. She got along great with John and Tom, and she was very disappointed because we lost one of the twins, you know. But still, having 3 of them, 3 and under, was still, it was exciting. I don't think how old. Well, then John got older, and this is kind of scary to me today. When he started kindergarten, he went to the St. Andrews didn't have kindergarten back in those days, so we went to the public school, which was a good mile down the road from where we lived. And I brought him a few times, you know, but then he learned to walk that by himself. And they did have, at the busy street corners, they would have a guard, you know, to help him across the street. And he never had any problems, but I look at it now and I think, oh, what was I thinking? Yeah, there are a few funny things that happened back then too. When Paul came along, we had rabbits, 2 rabbits we had raised from babies, little tiny babies that didn't even have fur on yet. Anyway, they got bigger and bigger and had a cage for them out in the backyard. And Oak would go out every morning and feed them before he left for work. And this one morning, I was getting the other 2 ready for school, and Paul had gone out with his dad, and he came in and he babbled something to me, and I said, "Okay, fine." I didn't know what he was saying. What he had been saying was, "I'd locked Daddy in the rabbit pen." And it wasn't, he couldn't stand up in it because it wasn't high enough, and he sure wasn't going to sit down in there. And he finally had to break when it was just one of these locks, you know, a piece of wood that you turned. And see, Paul had learned to turn it one way, but he couldn't, he didn't know how to unlock. And well, that's one time when your dad was really mad at me because I didn't come and rescue him. And I remember sitting on the stool in the kitchen just laughing and laughing. No, more I laughed, the madder he got, so. We had a lot of little incidences like that. I remember one time, too, we put Paul down for a nap and went to get him up and couldn't find his shoe. Found one tennis shoe and couldn't find the other one. We looked all over that room and could not find it, and didn't find it until I did my house cleaning that fall and turned the mattress. He had put it on, between the spring and the mattress on his bed. So I tell you, there are things that happen when you have big families that are really fun, in retrospect especially.
Did the kids get along
Did
for
what?
the most part? Did the kids get along for the most part?
Most part, yeah. They were boys, you know. And Mary was right in there with them, you know. That Mary was always the most timid, but she still got in her licks. But mostly they got along, and they loved having projects that they did together. Remember, we had a lot of snow back in those days, and we have movies of the kids now digging tunnels through the big mounds of snow.
Yeah, Tom wanted me to ask you about the blizzard in 1940, I believe, Was it 1941?
Oh, the Armistice Day Blizzard. No, I was still in lacrosse then. This is right before I went into nurses training. And my sister's boyfriend, we had the day off in school. I was in college then, so we had school, but high school didn't. And he and a friend of his went duck hunting out on the Mississippi River. And in the morning, it was a beautiful, warm day, sunny and bright and warm and just perfect day to be outside. So they went out on their boat with their dog, and the weather changed. And this happened the temperature just dropped, and it started raining, and that turned into snow and ice. And the boys were out with just this dog, and somehow they got separated, and Dick, my sister, well, she later married him, they were stuck, he got stuck on an island, and then somehow his friend and the dog had drifted away and lost the oar. They couldn't get back to him. So he all night was walking around this one tree on this island, round and round and round. And it wasn't until the next day that the Navy, not the Navy, Coast Guard rescued him. And his friend and the dog, they got them to, he had the dog with him all night, so that kept him warm. But they put Dick in the hospital, and they couldn't keep him in bed. He kept saying, I have to walk, and get out of bed and start walking again. He ended up, he didn't even catch cold. But it's a good family story.
How about the lake house and spending summers there?
The what? Oh.
The lake house?
Oh, I always said that was the best 20 years of my life. We visited some friends out there who had a lake cottage, and they said, they're opening up some new lots down the way here. Would you like to go and look at them? Well, I didn't go, but Oak went. And the next day I had taken the kids and gone to lacrosse for a few days. And when Oak came down to get us, he said, well, guess what I did today? No, why? What did you do? And he said, I bought those lots. And so then he got this little, what was his name now? I've forgotten. He was a carpenter, and between them they built that cottage. Well, he had other help that came in too, but they built the cottage. And then every summer, as soon as school was out, I was all packed and ready, and we moved out there and stayed out there all summer. It was a wonderful place to raise a family. And the kids loved it. And they learned a lot too. They learned how to run a boat, and Oak took the boys hunting often out into the wilds up there, which is not wild anymore. And I said the best summer we had, we only had to go into town once to go for their preschool examinations. So that was a really great time, and Oak loved it out there. That was the love of his life. And wherever we lived, he wanted everything to look like a park. Everything was manicured, and he loved growing things, and had plants and beautiful trees. And we also had an orchard out there. I think we had 16 trees. And an orchard can be a lot of fun, but it can be a lot of work. trees all had to be sprayed, but in the fall we would reap these huge harvests of apples, and we got to the point where we couldn't even give them away. So somebody said, "Why don't you sell them at the grocery store?" So we did. We'd pick them and bring a couple bushels in, and, and then the kids got the money for it. So then they thought maybe the work wasn't so hard after all.
So we've been so lucky to have you. We've been so lucky to have you in our lives, since we could remember. But many of the grandkids and of course the great-grandkids never got to meet Grandpa Oak and spend time with them.
Yeah.
So what do you think you would like them to know about him?
About him? Well, he enjoyed the outdoors, and if you some of John's kids remember him, and they remember being outdoors doing things with him all the time. But he also thought studies were very important, and he was right. That was a great importance. And schoolwork you had to get that done. That was important to him. And and he loved to tell them stories about his boyhood. He grew up in this real tiny town of Ottoville, Ohio, and he and his older brother, Gene, were out in the woods and playing along. There was a stream that went through, and they had a great time. And they went hunting, just had a real typical country boy life. And that was important to him too, and he loved talking about it and explaining things to them. And he loved carpentry. He had a heart attack when he was 51 and was in the hospital for 3 weeks. And when he came home, they treated heart attacks different back in those days. He wasn't to go back to work for another month. And so he built birdhouses down in our basement. And it was good that he had something like that he could do. If you want to know a little about my faith, the one thing that comes to mind is when he had this heart attack, he was 51, so I was only, 38 or something. Yeah, and Gene was 10 months old when that happened. And remember taking him into the I went along in the ambulance into the hospital with him, and Dr. Murphy, who was his doctor, had come to the house. He was a friend of ours too, and he stayed there with the kids until I could get somebody to come and stay with him. But I went into the hospital with him. I remember sitting by his bedside, and he was in an oxygen tent, and I was really frightened. And all of a sudden, this peacefulness came over me, and I thought, he's going to be all right. And I just think that was God or whoever that is up there taking care of us, because can you imagine what my life would have been if he hadn't made it through then? Yeah. So that faith keeps me going. My favorite morning prayer is, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad." Said sometimes it's hard to rejoice and be glad, but try.
So, Grandma, you've talked both about Oak and your faith recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you feel are important traits in a spouse or a partner, when maybe a perspective when you were younger and a perspective when you were older as well?
Older. Well, let's see. I guess the most important thing is love. And probably the second is communications. If you can talk to people, you can solve anything. And of course, you want one that you can have fun with, and laughing a lot is good. And understanding, trying to understand the other person, even if you don't agree with them, if you can try to figure out some way to get around it.
When did you know that you were in love with Grandpa Oak?
Well, I think it kind of crept up on me slowly, because really went with him for a good 6 months before we really started to get serious. I don't think there was just something about him that sparked my fancy.
Getting into more general questions, do you have any regrets in your life looking back?
Oh, probably tons, but trying to think of something particular. I guess I don't have any great regrets.
Are there any things that you would have done differently with your life?
Probably. Maybe I would have, if I hadn't gotten married, had gone back to school and gotten my degree in nursing, and maybe gone into not teaching as much as, well, it's teaching to help people, help young nurses to get the understanding of what being a nurse is really like. It seems to me that today a lot of them get a lot more book learning than we did, but they don't get the practical side of it.
And what advice would you give someone just going into school or nursing school?
Work hard. Study. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I know they say there's no such thing as a dumb question. Well, there are, but try not to ask those.
And how about advice for someone starting a new job?
Work hard.
And how about someone starting a marriage or becoming a parent?
Well, take your time and make sure you know somebody. You'll never know them as well as you will once you're married, but get to know them as much as you can and try to understand the different circumstances that they've gone through that you haven't, and try to just keep an even keel and don't rush it. Like Tim and Mary did.
Are there things that you worried about when you were younger that turned out to be unimportant, or that you wish you wouldn't have worried about?
I used to be very shy, and I remember being in school knowing the answers to questions and not raising my hand because I was afraid somebody would laugh or something. Well, that's ridiculous, I've learned that through the ages, but...
Are there things that you wish you would have paid more attention to?
Yeah, I think there are things, that, especially with my children, probably part of it is having a big family. You don't always have the time for each one, but I wish now I had spent more time with each one of them as they were growing up. But they all turned out pretty well, so I guess they made it.
Are there specific events in your life that you feel were more important or less important than you thought they would be?
I'm sure that's happened more than once, and I can't think of anything in particular right now.
Okay, how about, can you tell us what you have enjoyed about growing older and what you attribute your health and happiness to?
What I've enjoyed about growing older, because I've found out there are so many things that I thought were important and aren't really. And feeling more free to express myself, not caring so much what people think about me. I learned a lot since I moved into this building too and lived with all of these university people. You know, I only knew 2 people when I moved into this building, and I was very reticent to speak up or anything until I finally just kind of took my time and figured out what my priorities were and just went ahead and did things, got on different committees and found out what I could do and what I couldn't do and pursued it, and been a great place to live.
And who are your heroes?
You. Yeah, you are. No, I've John McCain. I always liked him. I guess I don't have anyone in particular.
And do you have any favorite books? Or what are your favorite books?
What are my favorite books? I've been reading quite a few biographies. I like those. And I like some fiction. I find it's a great way to relax is to read fiction. Trying to think of the name of some books in particular that I like. Of course, I loved Little Women. I loved that book when I was a child, and I still like it. And I like Gone with the Wind for the historical value of it, and I think that was a great book and movie. Guess that's it.
And what are your favorite songs?
Favorite songs, oh boy. I like all the oldies. I can't say much about this modern music. It just sounds like a lot of noise to me. But I used to like a lot of the dance music and nothing. Tim's here, so I better say I like some opera. I do, some of it.
Yeah. All right, if you could, what would you tell your younger self?
Don't be so self-absorbed. Reach out. As I say, too, forget what other people are thinking about you. Because I guess if you knew how little they did, you wouldn't worry about it.
What advice do you have for your grandkids and great-grandkids and generations going forward?
Just try to keep things simple. It's a crazy world out there, and it's getting crazier, I think, too. But try to find your own path, find what you like, and we have an example of that now, Molly, having worked, at a job that she really didn't like. She was doing very well with it, making good money. Wasn't easy for her to quit, but she did, and she's back in school now, and she wants to be teacher in special ed. And I admire that in her, that she was able to go ahead and follow her dream. Just hope it all works out for her.
Well, thank you, Grandma. There's, so many more stories that you have that we'd like to get on video at
Well,
some point.
Well, the next chapter maybe.
Yeah. But thank you, and we love you.
Well, you're surely welcome, and it's been a wonderful life. I really have no regrets. I've had a great time. I've had wonderful people in my life. I have a great family. What more could you ask for? Just all stick together and keep doing what you're doing, and life keeps happening.